So, if I go to the findings now, these methods have been applied more than 20 research groups around the world in different countries. In addition to Finland, in USA, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and also in some Latin American countries now, and many places. And there is the replication studies in different countries give the same findings than our original findings. That 3 to 7 years old children, which we studied in the beginning, have substantial individual differences in their spontaneous focusing on numericity. Then I promised yesterday that I will show one example of brain imaging studies where it really was important, and because now if we have the situation that there is a systematic difference, that some children always report the number or do something exactly according to the number. We still have the problem that we don't know, is it something which is already in the perception of the situation, or is it something which describes the tendency to make use of that numerical information or tell about that? And if you think that problem, we cannot solve it by using any behavioral methods. And then we carried out brain imaging studies with children EEG studies and with adults fMRI studies. And these studies clearly show that in those cases when the person reported the numericity, these were the picture studies, there were... Yes?
So you presented this kind of picture,
yes,
to subjects, and then asked, what did you ask them?
Ask them to explain the picture.
Okay, talk about the picture.
Yes.
And then the SFON students or SFON participants spontaneously refer to the number.
Yes.
Whereas
yes, they of course described also some other aspects, but systematically the number. And then the other participants described other aspects, but never but not the number. Mm-hmm. And then we compared these cases when they reported number with those cases when they didn't report number but reported color or something else. And this did show that there was activation within a first 100 milliseconds in the fMRI studies in the areas which are known to related to numerical in processing of numerical information. So that similarly the EEG study did show the same, that it is already in the perception. It is the difference. It is not in the tendency to make use of that. So that already in the perception of the situation there are differences if the people are spawning.
On the difference that the activation was stronger for
fMRI always is a comparison, so that if it is a statistical significant difference, and these colors, the beautiful colors you see in the brain imaging task, these are just a kind of visualization of statistical difference. And if there is a statistical difference, that these brain areas related to numerical cognition and activating more, statistically more, then we can conclude that there is a difference. And
I'm sorry, so statistically more than what? So what's the control, what's the baseline?
So the baseline, this is a contrast. When we compare cases where they then later on report numericity or don't report the numericity. We contrasted this.
So you are comparing across individuals?
No, these are not group. These are these cases, because in each picture we get this information that did they report the numericity or did they report color but not the numericity, and these were contrasted, and this did show that if the reported number, there were activation of statistically higher activation of numericity.
Looking at individual difference.
No, not this in this study, because this was better to make in this way, so that we looked these cases when the activation happened, when it didn't happen. Okay. So, and then I already told that there was kind of modern stability between different task types. The strong stability between different task types, but also moderate stability we did find, for example, from 3 years to 12 years, so that there was a relatively high intra-class correlation, so that the tendency to pay attention is somewhat stable. And then now there are plenty of studies showing that longitudinal studies showing that the differences in SFON are positively related to the later development of the system of natural numbers and arithmetic skills. First before school age, and then later on there are studies now showing that also during the first school years. And this is one of our relatively late studies. There I don't. It's to take too much time to tell what the subitization is, but I go to the SFON studies when children were 6 years old, and we measured the SFON tendency, and we also the counting skills, and then we looked the overall mathematical skills at the age of 12, and both these contributed to the mathematical skills, but SFON was a stronger contributor to the mathematical skills. And this finding has now been replicated in many studies in many countries. Then we also looked that we had this 12 years old population, and then which we had already measured the SFON at the age of 6, and then we measured it at the age of 12, and they still correlated highly. And then we looked how they predicted the new mathematical topic which students were studying at the age of 12. It was the rational number knowledge, so fractions and decimals. And the SFON measured at the age of 6 predicted the fraction comparison, which is very important for the conceptual understanding. Also fraction density and decimal density, understanding the rational number system, that because density is very important aspect of that you understand that between any two rational numbers there are infinity number of other rational numbers, that if we have, for example, 2/4 and 1/4 and 3/4, there's not only 2/4 in the between, but infinity number of fractions in between. And this understanding, which is very difficult for children, it seems that SFON predicted. But interestingly, SFON measured at the age of 12 didn't predict that. Our explanation was that, okay, this is a very important tendency that children develop the SFON tendency very early on. We have noticed it that 3 years is age when it becomes already relatively stable, and then we have intervention studies which show that we can enhance SFON tendency. And then we started that discussion in Finland. We presented all these results and discussed with people teaching primary school, pre-education teachers in universities, and then we discussed with the teachers and administrators, and gradually now these ideas are implemented in the national guidelines for early education, because in early education there is no formal teaching, but the idea in the daycare centers and in the preschool education, the idea is to support this kind of mental processes which are important for later school learning. And now, earlier it was mainly only about language. Now the triggering on spontaneous focusing on numericity is one implemented there in these general guidelines. And also the idea, what is important here is that now mathematics, when it starts in the beginning of primary school, is there's now we emphasize the continuation. It is exactly the same that children do in all kind of everyday situations, and this idea is now important issue in the during the early years of primary education, so that we try to guarantee that mathematics doesn't become a isolated piece of subject. Well, that's something which is a kind of natural way to see the environment, and that's we believe important in long term for the motivation of mathematics. But what was the problem? Okay, but then why we started to look the fractions? That was also came from the early studies showing what was the problem in Finnish education. That's of course a problem, particularly in the Western countries in general, that rational numbers is very difficult to learn, to understand them properly and to use them in practical situations. So that's why we focused on rational numbers and started to analyze them. And one of our studies have been that what happens when students move from natural numbers to rational numbers. There is now intensive tradition in there are a lot of this research in Europe and also somewhat in America about the conceptual change processes when students move from this more early number concept to more later number concept. And there are many changes. In natural numbers, it's simple to see what is the magnitude of the number, how big it is. But in rational numbers, it's much more complex. Then ordering what is bigger is very simple in natural numbers, but when we ask which is bigger, it's much more complex. And then for natural numbers, if we have number 5, there is the successor, the second number, it's 6, and then after 6 is 7, and this is very fundamental experience for young children. But in rational numbers, there are no. What is the next number after 1/4? You cannot define it in the field of rational numbers. So these are fundamental differences which make it difficult to conceptually understand rational numbers. And then we have made a lot of studies about that. This is now only one example of our studies where we looked the long-term development of natural numbers, and here we used the method that we looked this kind of latent profiles. If we look at different aspects, comparing rational numbers, ordering the numbers, and a density concept, we did find that there is a low group who are cannot do anything of this. Then this average group which can do somewhat, can understand them somewhat, and then a group which understands the the comparison and ordering, but the density is extremely difficult. There's only this highest group where they reached the density. And then several later studies have shown that this is really so that there's an order of difficulty, so that first students have to learn to understand how to see the size or the magnitude of rational numbers, and then later on they can understand the density. And then when we have looked that this low group is very stable, that was 1.5 years period. This is not developing at all, but here are the changes from the average group to the magnitude representation group. But then again the high group is very stable, so that it seems that this is a kind of very difficult development which is taking place in the field of rational numbers, and it requires intensive new approaches how we can help students to understand rational numbers, because there are many reasons to think that this is now one of the very fundamental.
How are they apart? How long are they apart?
This was 1.5 year.
1.5 years?
Yes.
Between time 1 and time 2?
Yes, sure, yes.